Why did the school nurse call the police when I showed up with bruises from the car accident? The police officer's hand was on his holster when he pulled me out of third period calculus, and for a split second, I thought someone had died. My mind went immediately to my little sister Maya, who was homesick that day, or my dad who'd been driving to work after dropping me off that morning. Officer Reynolds introduced himself with that careful tone cops use when they're not sure if you're a victim or a suspect, and asked if I'd come with him to speak with someone from Child Protective Services. I said sure, because what else do you say when a cop asks you a question, and because I genuinely had no idea what was happening. It wasn't until we walked past the nurse's office and I saw Mrs. Jillian standing there with her arms crossed and that tight-lipped expression of moral certainty that I started to understand. She'd called them. She'd looked at the bruises covering my arms and the cut above my eyebrow and the way I'd been limping since the accident 3 days ago, and she'd decided my dad was beating me. I was 16 years old, a junior at Northgate High School in suburban Michigan, and I'd never been in serious trouble in my life. My name is Austin Reeves, and before that morning in late October, my biggest concerns were maintaining my 3.8 GPA, getting more playing time on the varsity basketball team, and figuring out how to ask Melissa Crane to homecoming without embarrassing myself. My family was boringly normal in the best possible way. Dad worked as an electrical engineer at an automotive supplier, Mom was a registered nurse at the local hospital working night shifts, and Maya was a 13-year-old 8th grader who spent most of her time reading fantasy novels and arguing with me about whose turn it was to do dishes. We lived in a 3-bedroom house with a mortgage and a golden retriever named Biscuit, and our biggest drama was usually whose turn it was to take out the trash or whether we could afford to go to Disney World for spring break. The accident that destroyed all of that normalcy happened on a Sunday evening, completely random and entirely not our fault. Dad and I had been driving back from a basketball tournament 2 hours north. I'd played well, scored 18 points, and we'd won the championship game. Dad was in a great mood, talking about how my jump shot was improving and asking if I'd thought about which colleges I wanted to visit. The sun was setting, traffic was light, and we were maybe 20 minutes from home when a pickup truck ran a red light at a major intersection and slammed into the passenger side of our Subaru. The impact was instantaneous and devastating. I remember the sound first, metal crunching and glass exploding, then the sensation of being thrown sideways despite the seatbelt, my body slamming against the door and window, the airbags deployed with that chemical smell and the force that feels like being punched by a cloud. Everything went white and loud and chaotic, and then suddenly it was over, and we were sitting in a destroyed car in the middle of an intersection with the engine smoking and my ears ringing so loud I couldn't hear Dad asking if I was okay. The other driver, a man in his 50s who turned out to be driving drunk with a blood alcohol level nearly 3 times the legal limit, had hit us doing at least 50 in a 35 zone. His truck had struck us on my side, crumpling the passenger door inward and shattering both windows on that side. I'd taken the brunt of the impact despite the airbag. My right arm had multiple bruises from being slammed against the door, my ribs were bruised from the seatbelt, and I'd hit my head on something, leaving a gash above my left eyebrow that bled impressively. Dad had some bruising on his chest from his seatbelt and airbag, but he'd been on the far side from impact and came out much better than I did. Paramedics arrived within 10 minutes, along with police and fire trucks. They loaded me onto a backboard as a precaution, transported me to the ER, and spent the next 4 hours running tests to make sure I didn't have internal bleeding or a concussion. The CT scan came back clear, X-rays showed no broken bones, and they sent me home around midnight with prescriptions for pain medication, instructions to ice the bruises, and orders to follow up with my regular doctor within a week if symptoms didn't improve. Monday was a recovery day. I stayed home from school because I could barely move without pain shooting through my ribs and arm. The bruises were already turning spectacular shades of purple and yellow. The cut above my eyebrow had been glued shut in the ER, but looked angry and obvious. Mom stayed home from her shift to take care of Maya and me, since Maya had woken up with a fever and sore throat. Dad went to work, but came home early because his chest was hurting worse than he'd admitted the night before. By evening, we were a household of walking wounded, moving carefully, and passing the ice packs around. Maya thought our injuries were kind of cool in that morbid way teenagers do when it's not their own pain. She took photos of my bruises to show her friends, which I pretended to be annoyed about, but secretly thought was funny. The insurance company had already been contacted, police reports filed, and Dad's Subaru had been towed to a repair shop where they'd declared it totaled. We'd rented a replacement vehicle, started the claims process, and begun the tedious bureaucratic aftermath of a serious accident. But at least we were alive and relatively intact, which the ER doctor had pointed out could easily have gone the other way, given the speed and angle of impact. I went back to school on Thursday because I couldn't afford to miss more days with midterms approaching and because sitting at home was making me stir-crazy. Mom had offered to write a note explaining my absences and injuries, but I'd told her not to worry about it, that I'd just explain to my teachers if they asked. That morning, I'd dressed carefully in a long-sleeve shirt to cover the worst bruises on my arms, but there was no hiding the cut above my eyebrow or the slight limp from my bruised hip. Dad drove me to school in the rental car, asked 3 times if I was sure I felt up to attending classes, and told me to call if I needed to come home early. I assured him I was fine, grabbed my backpack, and headed into the building feeling mostly normal, aside from the persistent ache in my ribs whenever I breathed too deeply. First period was English, where Mrs. Kowalski asked what happened to my face. I explained about the accident, showed her the cut, and she made sympathetic noises before moving on with the lesson. Second period was the same, quick questions and sympathy from Mr. Brennan when he noticed me moving stiffly. I thought that would be the pattern for the day, minor inconvenience, and then back to normal routine. Third period was when everything went wrong. I had a free period that block and had gone to the library to work on a history paper. About 20 minutes in, I realized I'd left my laptop charger in my locker and decided to go grab it. On the way back through the main hallway, I passed the nurse's office and Mrs. Gillian was standing in the doorway. She called my name, asked me to come in for a moment, said she'd heard I'd been absent and wanted to make sure I was feeling all right. I didn't think anything of it. School nurses check on students who've been sick or injured all the time. I followed her into the small office with its examination table and charts about hand washing and immunizations, expecting a routine conversation about my absence and maybe some advice about managing pain or watching for delayed concussion symptoms. Instead, Mrs. Gillian closed the door behind us, and her expression shifted from friendly concern to something harder and more suspicious. She asked me to sit down. She asked what had happened to cause my injuries. I told her about the car accident, same explanation I'd given my teachers. Mrs. Gillian's eyes narrowed slightly as she wrote something on her notepad. She asked where exactly the accident had occurred, what time, whether police had been called. I answered truthfully because, again, why wouldn't I? She asked if I'd gone to the hospital, which hospital, what treatment I'd received. I explained about the ER visit, the tests, the medications. She asked who'd been driving. I said my dad. Her pen stopped moving. She asked if my father had been injured in the accident too. I said yes, but less than me because the impact was on my side. She made another note. Then she asked, in a tone that suddenly felt less like concern and more like interrogation, whether the accident had really happened the way I described it, or whether there was something else I wanted to tell her. The question caught me completely off guard. I asked what she meant. Mrs. Gillian said that in her 15 years as a school nurse, she'd seen a lot of injuries, and she'd developed an eye for which ones matched their stated causes and which ones didn't. She said my bruising pattern looked consistent with defensive wounds or repeated impacts rather than a single traumatic event. She asked if anyone at home ever hurt me, if I felt safe, if I needed help. The absurdity of the accusation made me actually laugh, which in retrospect was probably the worst possible response. I told her no, absolutely not, that my dad had never laid a hand on me in anger in my entire life, that the bruises were exactly what I'd said they were from a car accident that was documented by police and hospital records. Mrs. Gillian's expression didn't change. She said that many abuse victims initially deny what's happening to them out of fear or misplaced loyalty, that it was her job to ensure student safety even when students themselves didn't recognize danger. I stood up, said I appreciated her concern but there was nothing to worry about, and tried to leave. She told me to sit back down. Her voice had gone cold and authoritative. She said she'd already contacted Child Protective Services based on her assessment of my injuries, and that someone would be coming to interview me. She said I needed to stay in her office until they arrived. I asked if I was being detained, which I realized sounded ridiculous the moment I said it, but I genuinely didn't know what my rights were in this situation. Was a school nurse allowed to hold me against my will based on suspicions? Could I just walk out? Before I could decide, there was a knock on the door, and Principal Morrison walked in with Officer Reynolds, the school resource officer. They both had expressions that told me this wasn't a routine check-in. Principal Morrison said they'd received a concerning report from Mrs. Gillian about injuries suggesting possible abuse, and that they needed to follow district protocol by involving law enforcement and CPS to ensure my safety. I repeated everything I'd already told the nurse about the accident and the hospital and the police report. I offered to show them the discharge papers from the ER that my mom had tucked in my backpack in case any teachers had questions. Principal Morrison said they'd need to see those, but that given the seriousness of the allegations, they needed to conduct a more thorough investigation. That's when Officer Reynolds asked me to come with him, and that's when I ended up being pulled out of calculus in front of 30 classmates who definitely noticed a cop escorting me out of the building. We went to a small conference room near the administrative offices where a woman in her 30s was waiting. She introduced herself as Catherine Marsh from Child Protective Services, a licensed social worker with 9 years of experience in family services. She had a briefcase full of forms, and that same practiced expression of concern, mixed with suspicion, that seemed to be standard issue for people in her profession. Catherine asked me to describe what happened, starting from the beginning. I went through the whole story again, every detail I could remember about the accident and the aftermath. She took notes, but her questions kept circling back to my father. Had he been angry after the accident? Had he blamed me for anything? Had there been any arguments or tension at home since then? I kept saying no because the answer was no. Dad had been worried and relieved and focused on making sure I was okay. The only tension in our house was about who got to use the heating pad first, and whether Maya was faking the extent of her illness to get out of chores. Catherine asked about my relationship with my father before the accident, whether he'd ever hit me or threatened me, whether I'd ever felt afraid of him. Every question felt like a trap, like she was trying to trick me into contradicting myself or revealing something incriminating. I told her my dad was a good father, that we got along well, that he'd never been anything but supportive and kind. She asked about my mother, whether she was aware of my injuries, whether she'd seemed concerned or tried to minimize what happened. I explained that Mom was a nurse, that she'd checked me over thoroughly when we got home from the ER, that she'd been the one keeping track of my pain medication schedule and making sure I was following doctor's orders. The interview lasted over an hour, covering the same ground repeatedly from different angles. Catherine showed me diagrams of the human body and asked me to point to exactly where each injury was located. She took photographs of the visible bruises on my arms and the cut above my eyebrow, documenting everything with timestamps and detailed notes. She asked about school, about my grades and activities and friends, whether anything had changed recently in my behavior or mood. I explained that yes, I'd been upset and stressed because I'd been in a traumatic accident and was in pain and had missed school and basketball practice. She wrote that down as potentially concerning. At one point, she asked if I had a cell phone and whether she could see my recent text messages with my father. I asked if I had to show her, and she said technically no, but that cooperation would help resolve concerns more quickly. I unlocked my phone and handed it over because I had nothing to hide. She scrolled through weeks of mundane exchanges about picking me up from practice, asking what I wanted for dinner, reminding me to do homework. She spent extra time reading the messages from the day after the accident, where Dad had texted to ask how I was feeling and whether I needed anything from the store. She seemed almost disappointed that there was nothing suspicious or threatening in our communication. Finally, Catherine said she'd need to visit our home and interview my parents separately as part of the investigation. She said this was standard procedure for all reports of suspected abuse or neglect, that she wasn't making any judgments yet, but needed to gather complete information. She gave me her card and told me I could call her any time if I felt unsafe or wanted to talk further. Then she left, and I was released back to class having missed most of the school day. The rest of Thursday passed in a haze of whispers and stares. Word had spread that I'd been pulled out by a cop and questioned by CPS. My friends asked what happened, and I gave them the abbreviated version that seemed to make them more confused than enlightened. Why would the school nurse call CPS over car accident injuries? It made no sense to any of us. I texted my parents to warn them that someone from CPS would be contacting them, trying to keep the message casual so they wouldn't panic. Dad called me immediately, asked what the hell was going on, and I explained everything while sitting in the bathroom stall during lunch period so no one would overhear. I could hear the anger building in his voice as I described Mrs. Gillian's accusations and the interview with Catherine Marsh. He said he'd call our lawyer, that this was outrageous, and we needed to shut it down immediately. Our family lawyer, Gregory Finch, had handled our estate planning and the legal side of the accident claim. He was in his mid-50s, had practiced law for 28 years, and had a reputation for being thorough and slightly aggressive in protecting his clients. Dad called him from work and explained the situation, then put me on the phone to give my version. Gregory listened carefully, asking pointed questions about exactly what Mrs. Gillian and Catherine Marsh had said, what they'd documented, what they'd asked to see. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment before saying that unfortunately, school personnel had broad authority as mandatory reporters to file abuse reports based on reasonable suspicion, and that reasonable suspicion was defined loosely enough that almost anything could qualify. He said the CPS investigation would proceed regardless of how obviously baseless the accusations were, that we needed to cooperate fully while also protecting our rights. He said he'd draft a formal response documenting the accident with all supporting evidence and submit it to CPS and the school district. He'd also contact the police department to get copies of the accident report and any other documentation that might help. He told Dad not to speak to anyone from CPS or the school about this without him present, or at least on the phone, and to document everything from this point forward. Catherine Marsh showed up at our house that Friday evening without warning. I was doing homework in my room when the doorbell rang. Maya answered before Mom or Dad could get there, and suddenly there was a stranger in our living room introducing herself and saying she needed to speak with my parents. Mom was furious, the controlled fury of someone who works in healthcare and knows exactly how systems are supposed to work. She demanded to know why Catherine was at our home without prior notice, whether she had a warrant, what specific allegations were being investigated. Catherine said she didn't need a warrant for an initial assessment visit, that she was following up on a report of suspected child abuse, and that cooperation was in the family's best interest. Dad had come downstairs by then and immediately called Gregory Finch, putting him on speaker. Gregory told Catherine that she was not to interview anyone in the family without him present, that any questions needed to go through him, and that we'd be scheduling a formal meeting at his office where everything could be properly documented. Catherine looked annoyed but said that was within our rights, though she noted that lack of cooperation could be interpreted as concerning. Gregory responded that exercising legal rights wasn't lack of cooperation, it was following proper procedure, and that we'd have more than enough documentation to demonstrate the absence of any abuse. The formal meeting happened the following Monday at Gregory's office, a modern building downtown with conference rooms and law books and the kind of institutional furniture that makes everything feel serious and official. Catherine brought her supervisor, a man named Philip Granger, who'd been with CPS for 18 years and had the tired eyes of someone who'd seen too much actual abuse to be patient with false reports. Gregory had prepared a comprehensive packet of evidence, everything organized in a binder with tabs and labels. Police report from the accident including officer statements, witness information, and the drunk driver's arrest record. Hospital records from the ER including CT scans, X-rays, doctor's notes describing each injury and its mechanism. Photos of Dad's Subaru showing the extensive damage to the passenger side. Insurance claims documentation showing the vehicle was totaled. A letter from our family physician, Dr. Nathan Cross, who'd examined me during a follow-up visit and confirmed that all injuries were consistent with motor vehicle trauma. A letter from my basketball coach confirming I'd been at a tournament that Sunday and that Dad had been there watching. Even a statement from the opposing team's coach who remembered seeing us after the game. Gregory presented all of this methodically, walking through each piece of evidence and explaining how it created an undeniable timeline that proved my injuries came from the documented accident. Catherine and Philip reviewed everything carefully, asking occasional clarifying questions. Philip seemed increasingly convinced, but Catherine remained skeptical in a way that felt almost willful. She kept returning to her assessment that the bruising pattern seemed unusual for a car accident, that defensive wounds could be disguised as something else, that my initial laughter when questioned and my parents' aggressive legal response both suggested something being hidden. Gregory pointed out that laughing at an absurd accusation was a normal stress response, not evidence of abuse, and that hiring a lawyer when falsely accused was basic common sense, not suspicious behavior. He asked Catherine directly what evidence of abuse she'd actually found, beyond her subjective interpretation of injury patterns that multiple medical professionals had documented as consistent with vehicle trauma. She admitted she hadn't found any evidence of abuse, but maintained that the investigation needed to continue because she hadn't conclusively ruled it out. Philip interrupted her at that point and said that actually, the evidence presented was more than sufficient to close the case as unfounded. He said they'd document the accident as the verified cause of injury and note that there were no concerns regarding the family's care of their children. Catherine started to object, but Philip's expression made it clear the decision wasn't up for discussion. The investigation was officially closed by the end of that week, but the damage was already done. Mrs. Gillian had filed her report publicly enough that other staff members knew about it, and rumors had spread through school that I was being abused at home. Some kids believed it despite me telling them repeatedly what actually happened. Some teachers looked at me differently, with that careful concern that suggested they thought I was covering for my parents. My basketball coach pulled me aside to ask if everything was okay at home, saying he had to ask because he was a mandatory reporter too. I ended up having the same conversation over and over, explaining the accident, showing the evidence on my phone, watching people decide whether they believed me. Maya got questioned by her school counselor after someone reported that she'd also been absent recently, despite her absence being documented as legitimate illness with doctor's notes. She came home crying because the counselor had asked whether our parents ever hurt us and whether we felt safe, and she didn't understand why anyone would think our family was dangerous. Mom and Dad were both dealing with their own fallout. Mom's co-workers had heard about the CPS investigation through some nursing grapevine, and several had asked whether she was okay or needed help, which she found simultaneously touching and infuriating. Dad's situation was worse because Mrs. Gillian worked at the same school where he taught, and apparently she'd told other staff members about her suspicions before filing the formal report. Gregory advised us to document everything and consider our options for legal recourse. He said we might have grounds for a defamation lawsuit against Mrs. Gillian and possibly against the school district for failing to properly train or supervise mandatory reporters who filed obviously false reports. He explained that mandatory reporter status protected people from liability when they reported suspected abuse in good faith, but that protection had limits. If a reporter knew or should have known that their report was false, or if they failed to conduct even minimal investigation before reporting, they could potentially be held liable for the damage caused. He said we'd need to prove Mrs. Gillian acted with malice or reckless disregard for the truth, which would be difficult, but not impossible, given that she'd ignored my explanation about the accident and the readily available documentation. He recommended we start by filing formal complaints with the school district and with the state nursing board about Mrs. Gillian's conduct, documenting the harm caused by her false report. Then we could evaluate whether a lawsuit made sense based on how those complaints were handled. The school district complaint went nowhere. We submitted a detailed letter describing everything that happened, including the evidence that proved the accident was real, and Mrs. Gillian had made no effort to verify my explanation before calling CPS. The district's response came 3 weeks later from their legal department, a form letter explaining that school nurses were trained to report any suspected abuse and that the district supported staff members who followed appropriate protocols. The letter acknowledged that the investigation had been closed as unfounded, but said that didn't mean Mrs. Gillian had acted improperly, only that their concerns had been resolved. It thanked us for our understanding and said they considered the matter closed. Gregory called the response predictable but infuriating and said it was exactly the kind of bureaucratic protection that enabled false reporters. The complaint to the state nursing board was more promising. Michigan requires all licensed nurses to follow professional standards that include conducting appropriate assessment before initiating interventions, which arguably included CPS reports. Gregory's letter to the board argued that Mrs. Gillian had violated those standards by failing to verify readily available information about the accident before filing a report that caused substantial harm to our family. The board assigned an investigator named Diana Lawrence, who contacted us 6 weeks later to gather information. She interviewed me, my parents, and reviewed all the documentation. She also interviewed Mrs. Gillian, and according to Diana's eventual report, the nurse had stood by her decision completely. Mrs. Gillian maintained that she'd acted appropriately based on her professional judgment, that the bruising pattern had concerned her regardless of the stated cause, and that she'd rather file 100 false reports than miss one case of actual abuse. She said my reaction to her questions had reinforced her suspicions, and that in her experience, abuse victims often had elaborate cover stories that sounded believable. Diana's investigation took 4 months total, during which time we were stuck in limbo, unable to move forward with any legal action until the professional complaint resolved. Finally, in late March, 6 months after the original incident, Diana issued her findings. She concluded that while Mrs. Gillian's concerns about abuse were unfounded and her assessment had been inadequate, the nurse had acted within the broad latitude given to mandatory reporters. The board issued a formal letter of guidance, reminding Mrs. Gillian of her responsibility to conduct thorough assessments and consider objective evidence before initiating reports, but no actual disciplinary action was taken. Gregory said the nursing board's decision was disappointing, but not surprising, and that it actually helped our potential lawsuit by establishing that Mrs. Gillian's conduct had been problematic, even if not technically violation level. He drafted a civil complaint against Mrs. Gillian individually and the school district as her employer, alleging defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of our privacy rights. The complaint detailed everything that had happened: the false report and investigation, the damage to our reputations, the emotional harm to our family, the specific failures in Mrs. Gillian's assessment and decision-making. Gregory said we were seeking compensatory damages for the actual harm caused, plus punitive damages to deter similar conduct in the future. He filed the lawsuit in county court in April, and the school district's insurance company immediately moved to dismiss based on governmental immunity and mandatory reporter protections. The legal arguments got complicated quickly, centering on whether Mrs. Gillian's conduct fell within the scope of her protected reporting authority or whether she'd exceeded that protection by failing to conduct reasonable inquiry. The court scheduled hearings. Both sides filed multiple briefs, and months passed with no resolution. During this time, we discovered we weren't Mrs. Gillian's only targets. Gregory had filed a Freedom of Information Act request for records of all CPS reports filed by Mrs. Gillian in the past 5 years. The district fought the request initially, but eventually provided heavily redacted documents. Even with redactions, the pattern was clear. Mrs. Gillian had filed 27 CPS reports in 5 years, dramatically more than any other school nurse in the district. Gregory contacted families from some of those reports where the investigation had been closed as unfounded, and several agreed to speak with us. Their stories were disturbingly similar. Kids showing up with injuries from sports, accidents, or medical conditions. Mrs. Gillian jumping immediately to abuse conclusions. CPS investigations that found nothing wrong but still caused enormous stress and harm. One family had been investigated for 4 months after their son came to school with bruises from a mountain biking accident. Another family endured 3 separate investigations after their daughter's chronic illness caused symptoms Mrs. Gillian interpreted as signs of medical neglect. A third family was investigated because their son had behavioral issues that Mrs. Gillian decided must indicate abuse rather than the diagnosed ADHD his doctor was treating. Every family described the same pattern: Mrs. Gillian's rush to judgment, her refusal to credit reasonable explanations, her apparent conviction that she was saving children from danger that didn't exist. Gregory contacted a reporter at the Detroit newspaper who specialized in education and child welfare issues. Her name was Nicole Vasquez. She'd been covering these beats for 12 years, and she was immediately interested in the story. Nicole interviewed our family and 3 other families who'd been falsely reported by Mrs. Gillian. She obtained copies of the nursing board investigation report and the court filings from our lawsuit. She interviewed child welfare experts who confirmed that while mandatory reporting was important, serial false reporting by individuals undermined the system and harmed both families and real abuse victims who needed protection. Her article ran in mid-June with the headline, "School Nurses' Pattern of False Abuse Reports Leaves Families Traumatized." The article detailed Mrs. Gillian's history, the multiple unfounded investigations she'd triggered, and the lack of accountability from the school district or nursing board. It quoted from our lawsuit and from experts saying the system needed better mechanisms to identify and address reporters who consistently misuse their authority. The article got significant attention locally, shared widely on social media, discussed on local talk radio, and covered by television news stations that interviewed some of the affected families. The public pressure changed things. The school district's insurance company approached Gregory about settlement discussions. They were worried about the publicity and about the potential for a jury trial where multiple families would testify about Mrs. Gillian's pattern of false reports. Initial settlement discussions started around $30,000, which Gregory said was insulting given the documented harm and the district's refusal to take any accountability. He counter-offered at $250,000, plus a requirement that the district implement better training and oversight for mandatory reporters. The negotiations went back and forth for weeks, with the insurance company gradually increasing their offer while trying to avoid admitting any wrongdoing. Gregory kept pushing, citing the strength of our evidence and the likelihood that a jury would be sympathetic to our family and angry at Mrs. Gillian's conduct. In August, almost a year after the original incident, we reached a settlement for $175,000. The settlement required the school district to implement new protocols for reviewing CPS reports filed by school personnel, including supervisory review before reports were submitted and annual training on appropriate assessment standards. Mrs. Gillian would be required to complete additional training and would be subject to enhanced supervision of her reporting decisions. The settlement also included a confidential provision where the district formally acknowledged that our family had not abused or neglected any children and that the investigation had been unfounded. Mrs. Gillian never apologized. She never admitted she'd done anything wrong. According to Nicole's follow-up reporting, the nurse maintained that she'd simply been doing her job and that any harm to our family was unfortunate but necessary to ensure child safety. She said she'd continue reporting suspected abuse whenever she saw concerning signs because protecting children was more important than protecting adult feelings. The school district's Human Resources Department apparently agreed with her stance sufficiently that she remained employed, though with the new oversight requirements limiting her autonomy. But her reputation was damaged. Parents in the district knew her name now, knew her history, and many requested their children not be seen by her for anything beyond urgent medical needs. Teachers and staff who'd previously trusted her judgment became more skeptical when she raised concerns. She'd undermined her own credibility through sheer volume of false reports, and while she avoided official consequences, the informal consequences were significant. 2 other families filed lawsuits against the district based on her false reports, citing our case as precedent. The district eventually settled both of those cases as well, reportedly for similar amounts. The cumulative cost of Mrs. Gillian's false reporting pattern approached $500,000, and the district finally began taking the problem seriously. The money from the settlement helped with expenses, but didn't undo the damage. Maya had developed anxiety about authority figures asking questions, worried that normal answers might be interpreted as concerning and trigger another investigation. She started seeing a therapist to work through her fear of being questioned by school counselors or teachers. Mom had taken leave from work for a week during the worst of the investigation because she couldn't focus on patient care while worried about whether her own children might be taken away. Dad had considered looking for jobs at different schools because being in the same building as Mrs. Gillian made him furious every day. I'd lost trust in systems that were supposed to help. When teachers or coaches or other adults in authority positions asked how I was doing, I found myself calculating whether honest answers might be misinterpreted, whether showing any vulnerability might be seen as evidence of problems at home. The experience had taught me that telling the truth wasn't always enough, that even with documentation and evidence and obvious innocence, you could still be treated as guilty until proven otherwise, and that proving otherwise was exhausting and expensive and took months of your life. I'm 18 now, graduated from high school and starting college in the fall. The bruises from the car accident healed within a few weeks. The cut above my eyebrow left a small scar that you can only see if you're looking for it. But the experience left different kinds of scars that take longer to fade. I chose to write about this experience in my college application essay, describing what I learned about justice systems and advocacy and the importance of documentation. Several admissions counselors mentioned that essay specifically when calling to offer acceptance, saying it demonstrated resilience and maturity. Maybe something good came from the trauma. Maybe having your innocence questioned and your family investigated when you're 16 prepares you for a world where authorities don't always act reasonably and systems don't always protect the right people. Or maybe that's just what I tell myself to make sense of what happened. Mrs. Gillian still works at Northgate High School. She still files CPS reports regularly, though supposedly with better oversight now. I wonder sometimes if she ever thinks about our family and whether she caused unnecessary harm, or if she's convinced herself that false reports are acceptable collateral damage in a war against abuse. I wonder if she sees the news stories about families traumatized by false investigations and feels any responsibility, or if she's constructed a narrative where she's always the hero protecting children from danger that may or may not exist. The drunk driver who hit us that Sunday evening was convicted of aggravated DUI and sentenced to 4 years in prison. He destroyed Dad's car and caused injuries that hurt for weeks, but healed eventually. Mrs. Gillian's actions caused different damage that lasted much longer and hurt in ways that are harder to quantify. Both of them were reckless and caused harm, but only one faced real consequences. The other kept her job and her authority and her absolute certainty that she'd done nothing wrong. I've learned to live with that injustice, because you don't always get satisfying endings in real life. Sometimes the bad guys don't lose their careers or face public humiliation or learn important lessons. Sometimes they just continue on, convinced of their righteousness, while the people they harmed have to rebuild their lives and learn to trust again. That's where we are now. Still rebuilding, still learning, still carrying scars from bruises that healed a long time ago, but left marks that went deeper than skin. If you enjoyed this, you'll definitely want to see the next ones too. So subscribe now and let me know your take in the comments.